What happens when a 14-year-old girl walks into court, facing felony charges she didn't commit? How does she expose the flaws in the evidence, outsmart a seasoned prosecutor, and make the judge question the entire case? Ava Coleman wasn't just fighting for her freedom. She was fighting against a system designed to break her. Watch how she turns the courtroom upside down in this gripping story from H2, Black Thread. Like and subscribe for more powerful stories.
The heavy metal door groaned as it swung open, revealing the sterile, dimly lit hallway leading to the courtroom. The air smelled of disinfectant and something else, something metallic and stale, like old paper and rusted iron. The cuffs around Ava Coleman's wrists were cold, biting into her skin as the bailiff guided her forward. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to let it show. She had learned in just a few short days that fear was a weakness inside these walls. The moment they saw it, they would pounce. The guards, the lawyers, the judge, even the spectators in the gallery, they all wanted to see her break. But she wouldn't give them the satisfaction. She stepped forward, clad in an oversized orange jumpsuit, the fabric rough against her skin, as if it was designed to strip away every ounce of dignity she had left. The cuffs on her wrists clinked softly as she moved, but the real weight pressing down on her wasn't metal. It was the suffocating sense of judgment. The courtroom was filled, packed in fact. Whispers hummed through the space like a quiet storm, flickering glances landing on her before being averted. She caught the expressions: curiosity, doubt, indifference, suspicion. Some of the spectators leaned in, eager to witness what they assumed would be the downfall of a young girl who had dared to step out of line. But she wasn't guilty. The judge, an older white man with thinning silver hair, adjusted his glasses and sighed loudly, as if this whole proceeding was a waste of his time. Judge Gregory Henshaw. He was notorious in Louisiana for his no-nonsense, tough-on-crime stance, especially when it came to minors. He believed in teaching lessons rather than granting leniency. Ava could see it in the way he shuffled his papers carelessly, not even sparing her a proper glance. To him, she was just another case file, just another statistic. At the prosecutor's table sat Jonathan Merrick, a man in his early 40s with slicked-back blonde hair and a smugness that made Ava's skin crawl. His suit was perfectly pressed, a stark contrast to the jumpsuit swallowing Ava's small frame. He exuded confidence, sitting tall, a predator who had already cornered his prey. He had evidence, a witness, and Ava's unfortunate proximity to the crime scene. In his mind, the case was already closed. Ava's lawyer, Matthew Price, barely looked at her as she sat down beside him. A public defender, overworked and underpaid, flipping through his folder filled with nothing but standard paperwork. His suit had wrinkles, his tie was slightly askew, and he smelled of cheap coffee and exhaustion. He hadn't asked her a single meaningful question since they met. He didn't believe in her innocence, or worse, he didn't care. The bailiff cleared his throat. Court is now in session. The state of Louisiana versus Ava Coleman. Charges: felony theft and destruction of property. The words echoed, bouncing off the walls and settling over Ava like a noose tightening around her throat. Ava's hands clenched into fists beneath the table, her fingernails digging into her palms. Felony theft. Felony. They made it sound so criminal. Like she was some hardened delinquent, like she had masterminded some elaborate heist. She wasn't a criminal. She was a 14-year-old girl. Judge Henshaw exhaled loudly, flipping through the papers in front of him. Finally, his eyes lifted, cool and indifferent. "Let's get this over with," he muttered. "Prosecution, proceed." Merrick stood, his expression unreadable but his posture radiating control. "Your Honor, the evidence is clear." The defendant, Ava Coleman, was caught on surveillance footage at Devereaux Jewelers just moments before the store's alarm was triggered. The footage shows a girl matching her height and build reaching into a display case. Shortly after, the store's security system was disabled, and an $18,000 diamond necklace vanished. Ava kept her expression neutral, but inside her mind was racing. Surveillance footage. She hadn't been near that store. Merrick continued, his voice smooth and authoritative. Additionally, we have a witness, a security guard who saw a girl matching the defendant's description fleeing the scene. Ava swallowed, forcing herself not to react. The word matching wasn't the same as identical. They didn't have her on tape. They had someone who could have been her. Her public defender, Price, shifted awkwardly beside her, flipping through his notes as if looking for something, anything, useful. Finally, he stood, clearing his throat. His voice lacked conviction. "Your Honor, my client is only 14 years old. She has no prior criminal record, no history of theft, no evidence of behavioral issues. There is no physical evidence tying her to the crime. We ask that the charges be reconsidered," Merrick scoffed. "No prior record doesn't mean she's innocent. It just means she hasn't been caught before." Ava's fists clenched tighter. That smug, condescending tone. He was treating her like she was some kind of career criminal rather than a kid who had never been in trouble before. Judge Henshaw rubbed his forehead, looking at both sides with thinly veiled impatience. "Let's not waste time. Does the defense have an argument, or are we going straight to witness testimony?" Ava turned to look at her lawyer, hoping, praying, that he would stand up and fight for her. But all he did was shuffle his papers again, avoiding her gaze. She knew in that moment that she was alone in this fight. No one was coming to save her. Her lawyer wasn't going to question the evidence properly. He wasn't going to tear apart the inconsistencies in the prosecution's claims. If she wanted to prove her innocence, she was going to have to do it herself. Ava sat up straighter, her mind sharpening. They had surveillance footage, fine. Let's see it. They had a witness, fine. Let's hear from them. But Ava knew one thing that no one else in this room did: she wasn't there. And if they had built their entire case on assumptions, she was going to tear it apart piece by piece. With her heart pounding, she finally spoke. Her voice was clear, steady, and filled with quiet defiance. "Show me the footage." Silence fell over the courtroom. Judge Henshaw arched an eyebrow. "Excuse me." Ava turned her head, locking eyes with Merrick, daring him to show his so-called evidence. "The footage," she repeated. "Show it." A flicker of hesitation crossed the prosecutor's face before he nodded at the bailiff. Moments later, the screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life. The grainy black and white footage began to play. Ava watched, her mind racing. This was it. The moment everything would begin to shift. The courtroom fell silent as the grainy black and white footage flickered onto the screen. The video, captured by the security cameras inside Devereaux Jewelers, showed a hooded figure moving cautiously through the aisles of glittering display cases. The quality was poor, distorted, pixelated, but the outline of the person was clear enough: slim, medium height, wearing a hoodie and sneakers. Prosecutor Jonathan Merrick rose to his feet, stepping forward as if he were unveiling undeniable proof of Ava's guilt. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, addressing Judge Gregory Henshaw, "what you are about to see is clear and compelling evidence that the defendant, Ava Coleman, was inside Devereaux Jewelers on the night in question. You will see a figure reaching into a display case moments before the security system was disabled. Shortly after, a necklace worth $18,000 disappeared." Ava watched intently, her jaw clenched. She was already bracing for what came next. The figure on the screen hesitated near a glass display, their face obscured by the shadow of the hood. Then they reached forward, slipping their hand into the case just as the screen glitched for a split second. When the footage resumed, the figure turned sharply toward the door, darting out of sight just as the alarm lights began flashing. Merrick turned toward the jury with a confident nod. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is what we call damning evidence." Ava's stomach twisted, but not with fear. She had seen enough. Her fingers curled against the table as she exhaled slowly, pushing down her frustration. "They think this is damning. They think this proves I'm guilty." She forced herself to sit still as Merrick continued, his voice dripping with authority. "And if that weren't enough, we have a witness, Devereaux Jewelers' night security guard, Robert Langley, who saw a girl matching the defendant's description running away from the store at the exact time of the incident." Ava glanced at her court-appointed lawyer, Matthew Price, who was scribbling something meaningless on his legal pad. He had barely reacted to the footage, barely even glanced at her. It was obvious that he had already given up. She gritted her teeth. If he wasn't going to fight for her, she would have to do it herself. She leaned forward, her voice breaking through the courtroom silence like a sharp blade. "Pause the footage." For a second, no one moved. Then Judge Henshaw let out a tired sigh. "Miss Coleman, your attorney should be handling. Just pause it." Ava's voice didn't waver. Henshaw's eyes narrowed, but he gave a small nod to the bailiff, who pressed a button, freezing the image on the screen. Ava stood, stepping forward. Her shackles clinked softly as she moved. She turned toward Merrick, locking eyes with him before pointing at the still frame on the screen. "Look at the suspect's left hand." The prosecutor's expression barely faltered, but Ava could see the stiffness in his shoulders as he slowly turned toward the screen. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom as people squinted at the image. The suspect's left hand was partially visible, fingers slightly curled, the outline of a small ring glinting under the dim store lighting. Ava lifted her hands. No rings. She had never worn a ring in her life. Judge Henshaw shifted in his seat, staring at the image before turning his gaze toward the prosecutor. "Mr. Merrick," the judge said slowly, "I assume you were aware of this detail." Merrick's lips pressed together before he forced a tight-lipped smile. "Your Honor, this is merely a minor inconsistency." "A ring hardly disproves that the defendant was there." Ava didn't back down. "It's not a minor inconsistency. It's proof that this isn't me." She let her words hang for a moment before stepping closer to the screen, gesturing toward the figure's feet. "Now, rewind the footage 5 seconds." The bailiff did as she asked, and the video replayed, the suspect moving quickly but not smoothly. Ava had noticed it immediately, something off about the way they walked. "Pause." Again, the footage froze. Ava took a step forward, pointing at the suspect's shoes. "Look at them closely. They're too big." Another ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Judge Henshaw peered at the image, his forehead creased slightly. Ava turned to the jury, making sure to meet as many eyes as she could. "If you look at the way they're walking, you can see it. Whoever this is, their shoes don't fit them properly. They're slightly dragging their feet, trying to keep them from slipping off." A juror, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes, leaned forward slightly in her seat, focusing on the screen. Ava knew she had planted doubt. Merrick, however, wasn't ready to back down. "Circumstantial," he said smoothly. "Even if the shoes were a little loose, it doesn't prove. And one more thing." Ava cut him off coldly, turning toward the security footage one last time. "Your witness, the security guard, he said he saw me running from the scene, correct?" Merrick nodded slowly, as if bracing for where this was going. Ava crossed her arms. "What color hoodie did he say I was wearing?" The prosecutor hesitated, just for a second, but Ava saw it. She turned back to the jury, her voice steady, "Because in the police report he described it as gray." She gestured toward the screen, "But the hoodie in the footage is black." For the first time, Judge Henshaw actually looked surprised. He turned toward the prosecutor, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Merrick." The prosecutor's jaw tightened slightly, his posture still rigid with control, but Ava could see the tension beneath the surface. He was losing ground. Ava let the silence stretch before she spoke again, her voice unwavering. "So let's sum up what we actually have here." She turned toward the jury, deliberate and precise. "A video of someone who wears rings, which I don't. Someone with shoes too big for them, which mine aren't. And a witness who says they saw a girl running, except they got the hoodie color wrong." Ava paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the courtroom. "Does that sound like real evidence to you?" The jury wasn't looking at Merrick anymore. They were looking at her. She had planted the seed of doubt, and she wasn't finished yet. The air in the courtroom was charged, the weight of Ava's revelations settling over the jury, the judge, and even the spectators in the gallery. Ava could feel the shift. It was subtle but undeniable. The once smug confidence on Prosecutor Jonathan Merrick's face had thinned, his practiced ease replaced with an almost imperceptible tension. He wasn't smiling as much. His eyes flickered toward the jury more often now, gauging their reactions, trying to measure the damage Ava had done. She had just turned his airtight case into a leaky mess, and she wasn't done. Judge Gregory Henshaw leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together, his eyes fixed on Ava with a newfound curiosity. She wasn't just another defendant in his courtroom. She had proven that she wasn't going to sit back and let herself be railroaded. A slow breath escaped him before he spoke. "Miss Coleman, you certainly have a sharp eye." Ava remained silent, waiting for the rest of his statement. "But this isn't a game of spot the difference. You're still on trial for felony theft." She didn't flinch. "I know." There was a quiet murmur in the courtroom. People weren't used to a 14-year-old speaking with this much confidence in a courtroom, especially not a 14-year-old in an orange jumpsuit. Merrick cleared his throat, recovering some of his composure. "Your Honor, the defendant is attempting to create reasonable doubt with technicalities, but the fact remains, she fits the description and she was in the area." Ava turned her head toward the prosecutor, her expression unimpressed. "Actually, that's not a fact. That's an assumption." Merrick's jaw tightened slightly. Ava saw her chance. "And speaking of assumptions," she continued, turning back to the judge, "the burden of proof isn't on me, is it?" The judge arched an eyebrow, interested now. "What do you mean?" Ava straightened her posture. "In a criminal case, who holds the burden of proof?" For the first time, Henshaw cracked a small, amused smile. "You tell me, Miss Coleman." Ava didn't hesitate. "The prosecution." The judge tilted his head slightly, gesturing for her to continue. "And what is the standard?" "Beyond a reasonable doubt." Henshaw nodded. "Correct." Ava turned her attention back to Merrick. "So if you can't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that I committed this crime, then I have to be acquitted." "That's not a technicality, that's the law." Another ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Merrick opened his mouth, but no words came out. He had underestimated her. Judge Henshaw sat forward now, lacing his fingers together. His voice was calm, but there was an undeniable edge of curiosity to it. "Since you seem to know your law, Miss Coleman, let's play a little game." Ava's lawyer, Matthew Price, shifted uncomfortably beside her. "Your Honor, I don't think." The judge held up a hand, silencing him. His attention remained on Ava. "I'll ask you a few legal questions. If you answer them correctly, I'll take your claims more seriously. If you're as smart as you think you are, this should be easy." Ava glanced toward the gallery. Her grandfather, Daniel Coleman, sat near the back of the courtroom. He hadn't spoken a word throughout the trial, but he was watching, waiting, his face calm, unreadable. She turned back to the judge. "Go ahead." There was a flicker of something unreadable in Henshaw's eyes before he asked his first question. "Miranda v. Arizona, What is its significance? Ava barely needed to think. It established the Miranda rights, but it wasn't just about that. It was about police coercion and the Fifth Amendment. You can't use a confession in court if the suspect wasn't properly informed of their rights. Henshaw's lips pressed into a thin line. Merrick shifted uneasily in his seat. The judge tapped his fingers on his bench. Good. Now tell me, what is the exclusionary rule? Ava held his gaze. If evidence is obtained illegally, it can't be used in court. Map v. Ohio, 1961. The jury was no longer whispering. They were staring. Judge Henshaw lifted his gavel, tapping it lightly against the bench. Last question, Miss Coleman. Answer this right, and I'll consider taking your claims more seriously. Ava squared her shoulders. When can a minor be tried as an adult in the state of Louisiana? A slow smile spread across her face. Under Louisiana law, a minor can be transferred to adult court if they are over 15 and the offense is serious enough, like murder or armed robbery. But theft, she shook her head. Not unless they have a serious prior record, which I don't. A heavy silence settled over the room. Merrick's expression had soured, his fingers tightening around the edge of his table. The judge finally leaned back, exhaling through his nose. Then he turned to the prosecutor. Counselor, remind me, why are we treating this case like a felony? Merrick's jaw clenched. He tried to mask his frustration, but it was clear. He could feel the case slipping through his fingers. His voice was noticeably stiffer when he spoke. Your Honor, this is impressive, really. But let's not pretend this changes anything. She still fits the description. She was arrested a few blocks away. The witness saw her. Ava tilted her head. The witness saw someone. Merrick's head snapped toward her. Excuse me, she turned to the jury. He's counting on you to assume I'm guilty because someone thinks they saw me. Her voice didn't waver. But eyewitness testimony is unreliable. People fill in gaps. They see what they expect to see. Merrick scoffed. And now you're an expert. Ava didn't blink. I don't have to be. The Supreme Court already said it for me. She turned toward the judge. Perry v. New Hampshire, 2012. They ruled that eyewitness testimony isn't always reliable, especially without police misconduct to back it up. Judge Henshaw's eyes narrowed slightly. You're saying the witness might be mistaken? Ava nodded. I'm saying it wouldn't be the first time. The courtroom buzzed with whispers again. Judge Henshaw exhaled sharply, rubbing his forehead. Then, finally, he turned back to Merrick. Counselor, do you have anything besides this witness? Merrick hesitated. The room waited. Ava could feel it now. The shift was no longer subtle. She had forced them to reconsider everything, and the prosecution wasn't prepared for it. The courtroom door swung open, and Robert Langley stepped inside. A hesitant, middle-aged man with a neatly pressed uniform and a badge that looked far more official than his demeanor. He wasn't a detective, nor a high-ranking officer, just a security guard who had been working at Devereaux Jewelers for years, likely more familiar with closing shifts and inventory checks than actual crime scenes. Ava studied him as he walked toward the witness stand. He was nervous. His hands fidgeted against his pants and he cleared his throat twice before even sitting down. He didn't want to be here. Good. Judge Henshaw peered down at him. State your name for the record. Langley swallowed. Robert Langley. Prosecutor Jonathan Merrick stood, his tone calm, calculated. He needed Langley's testimony to anchor the case, to remind the jury that even if Ava had outmaneuvered him with technicalities, there was still an eyewitness. Mr. Langley, you were working at Devereaux Jewelers the night of the alleged theft. Langley nodded. Yes, sir. And did you see the defendant near or inside the store? Langley nodded again, his voice a bit stronger. I believe I did. Merrick turned toward the jury, reinforcing his narrative. Can you describe what you saw? Langley shifted in his seat, as if replaying the memory in his head. I was at my usual post by the security monitors when I heard the alarm go off. I looked up, and I saw a girl running out of the store. Merrick smirked slightly, knowing that simple statement was enough to cast guilt over Ava like a shadow. And you are certain that girl was the defendant, Ava Coleman? Langley hesitated just for a second. Ava caught it. I mean, yeah, looked like her. Not it was her. A crucial difference. Merrick seemed satisfied. No further questions, Your Honor. He sat down, his smirk returning. The jury was paying attention again. Now it was Ava's turn. Her lawyer, Matthew Price, barely glanced at her before standing. His voice lacked energy. The defense may cross-examine. Ava, shackles and all, stood before her lawyer could even begin. I'll do it. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Judge Henshaw raised an eyebrow, his patience thinning. Miss Coleman, you are not an attorney. I don't have to be, I just have questions. A pause, then a reluctant nod from Henshaw. Go ahead. Ava turned to Robert Langley, her dark eyes unblinking. Mr. Langley, you say you saw a girl running out of the store, correct? Langley nodded slowly. That's right. Ava tilted her head slightly, her voice calm. And what was she wearing? Langley hesitated. A hoodie. Ava didn't let him stop there. What color was it? Langley blinked. Gray. Ava turned toward the jury immediately, gesturing toward the paused security footage still displayed on the screen. Ladies and gentlemen, the suspect in the footage is wearing a black hoodie. A new ripple of murmurs filled the courtroom. Judge Henshaw glanced toward the screen, frowning. Even he hadn't noticed it before. Ava's voice remained steady. Are you sure the hoodie was gray, Mr. Langley? Langley shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I think so. You think so? Ava echoed, letting the words hang in the air. Langley cleared his throat, but the doubt was already spreading. She wasn't done. Ava stepped closer, her movements deliberate. Where were you standing when you saw the girl run out? Langley frowned. By the front counter near the security monitors. Ava nodded as if calculating something. And where was the store entrance in relation to where you were? Langley hesitated. About 25 feet away. Ava turned back to the jury. 25 feet away. From inside the store behind a counter looking through a glass window at night. Langley exhaled sharply, realizing where this was going. You didn't see her face clearly, did you? Langley hesitated, and that hesitation was enough. Ava took one more step forward. So you don't actually know that the girl you saw was me? Langley's jaw tensed. I mean, it looked like you. Looked like me, Ava interrupted, her voice like a blade cutting through his words. Ava turned to the jury, driving her point home. He didn't see my face, he guessed, he assumed, just like the prosecution assumed, and in the justice system, assumptions aren't enough. A beat of silence. Langley looked down, his confidence shattered. The damage was done, but Ava wasn't finished. She turned toward Merrick, locking eyes with him. Where's the missing necklace? The prosecutor's face twitched slightly. Excuse me. Ava kept her gaze steady. The necklace, the one I supposedly stole, where is it? Merrick's jaw tightened. We don't need to find the necklace to prove. You do, actually, Ava shot back. Because theft means taking something. And if you don't have what was stolen, how do you know I had it? The courtroom was silent. Judge Henshaw's gaze narrowed slightly. Merrick's confidence was cracking. Ava pressed further. You have no physical evidence. She turned to the jury. No stolen property, no fingerprints, no DNA. Just a blurry video of someone who isn't even wearing the same color hoodie I was arrested in, and a witness who admits he only thinks it was me. She let the silence stretch. Then she asked the final question that sealed the turning point of the trial. Does that sound like proof beyond a reasonable doubt? The courtroom buzzed. Judge Henshaw rubbed his forehead, then turned toward Merrick. Counselor, does the state have any material evidence tying the defendant to the stolen property? Merrick's lips parted, but no words came out. The room shifted. Ava had just flipped the case upside down. For the first time, the judge wasn't looking at her like a defendant. He was looking at her like someone who might be telling the truth. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension, every eye fixed on the prosecution table, where Jonathan Merrick sat stiffly, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his pen. The confidence he had once exuded was gone, replaced with frustration. He had lost control, and he knew it. Ava Coleman sat still at the defense table, her hands resting in her lap, but her mind was racing. She had done everything she could. She had poked holes in the prosecution's case, exposed the flaws in the witness's testimony, and highlighted the lack of physical evidence. Now, all she could do was wait. Judge Gregory Henshaw tapped his gavel lightly against the bench. His expression was unreadable, his sharp gaze flickering between Merrick and the jury. "I believe we've heard enough." Ava held her breath. The judge turned toward the jury box. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you may now deliberate." A quiet buzz rippled through the room as the jury stood and filed out of the courtroom. Some glanced back at Ava, others at Merrick. As the heavy doors swung shut behind them, the tension in the room only grew thicker. Ava exhaled slowly. She refused to show any nerves, but inside, her stomach twisted. Would they believe her? Or had the system already made up its mind about her long before she ever stepped into this courtroom? Minutes stretched into an hour. Then another. The jury was taking longer than expected. Merrick had retreated into silence, his usual smugness now replaced with irritation. He kept stealing glances toward the jury door, shifting in his seat. Ava, however, barely moved. Her grandfather, Daniel Coleman, remained seated in the gallery, his expression calm, but his dark eyes watching everything. Finally, after nearly 3 hours, the jury returned. The bailiff stood. "All rise." Ava pushed herself up, standing tall despite the heaviness in her chest. She glanced at the jury members, searching their faces for any hint of what was coming. But they gave nothing away. The jury foreman, a middle-aged man with graying hair, cleared his throat and unfolded the small slip of paper in his hands. Judge Henshaw nodded. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman nodded once. Ava's hands curled into fists at her sides. "This is it. Everything depends on these next few seconds." The foreman took a deep breath, then spoke. "We, the jury, find the defendant." A pause. The world stopped moving. "Not guilty." The words crashed over Ava like a wave. For a brief moment, no one reacted. Then the silence broke. A gasp from the gallery. A frustrated exhale from Merrick, the clerk recording the verdict with an audible click of her pen. Ava didn't move. She had spent days preparing for the worst, expecting the worst. And now she was free. Judge Henshaw nodded, his expression unreadable. "The defendant is dismissed. This court is adjourned." The gavel came down one final time. Ava let out a slow, measured breath. It was over, but she still felt like she was standing in the middle of a battlefield. The moment the courtroom doors opened, Ava stepped outside, the weight of it all hitting her at once. She was free. She should have felt relieved. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, she felt angry, because it shouldn't have come to this. If she hadn't fought tooth and nail, used every ounce of knowledge she had, refused to back down, would she have been convicted? Would she have been locked away for something she didn't do? Her hands were still trembling. The cool air outside the courthouse brushed against her skin, grounding her for the first time. She looked up at the sky, the sun beginning to dip toward the horizon. She had won. But the fight hadn't ended. It had just changed. Her grandfather, Daniel Coleman, walked beside her. His movements were slower these days, his back slightly bent with age, but his mind was as sharp as ever. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he finally stopped, turning to face her. "You did good in there." Ava swallowed, staring down at her hands. They were still shaking. "It shouldn't have even come to this." Daniel nodded slowly. "No, it shouldn't have." Ava clenched her jaw. "They wanted to lock me up over nothing." Her grandfather's gaze was steady. They didn't see it as nothing. She exhaled sharply. I wasn't even there. They didn't care. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a lifetime of understanding. Ava felt her anger tighten in her chest. Next time, what if someone doesn't know how to fight back? Daniel sighed, the lines in his face deepening. Then they lose. The words hung between them. Ava hated that answer. She hated it because it was true. She turned back, looking at the courthouse behind her, the building that had nearly swallowed her whole. Her grandfather watched her closely. Then, after a moment, he gave her a small nod. Unless people like you make sure that changes. Ava looked up at him. People like me. His eyes gleamed. You got up there and tore their case apart, piece by piece. You knew more than the prosecutor, more than the judge even. That's not normal, Ava, that's a gift. Ava frowned slightly. I shouldn't have to know the law just to prove I'm innocent. Daniel nodded. No, you shouldn't. Then, after a pause, but you do know it. And now you know how the system works. More importantly, you know how to break it apart when it's wrong. Ava hesitated. The words sat heavy in her chest. She had spent days terrified of what might happen. But in that courtroom something had shifted. The fear had turned into something else, something sharper. Resolve. She looked down the street, past the courthouse, past everything behind her. So what now? She finally asked. Her grandfather smiled slightly. That's up to you. Ava exhaled slowly. The weight of everything was still there. The fight, the injustice, the narrow escape, it was still fresh. But underneath it all, she knew this wasn't the end of the story. She wasn't just walking away from a courthouse. She was walking towards something bigger. Because today she had defended herself. But tomorrow, she might be defending someone else.